Snow fell that evening as though the sky itself were holding its breath, each flake drifting in silence, fragile yet persistent. It was the kind of weather that made a person feel watched by the world, caught between the hush of eternity and the loneliness of one's own footsteps. And it was in this hush that curiosity begins. What becomes of a young widow who dares to whisper for company in a town that would rather see her endure her sorrow alone? Clara May Thompson stood outside her cabin, the hem of her dress damp with snow, her shawl drawn tight around her shoulders. At 25 she still carried beauty that drew attention, but beauty could be a curse when paired with misfortune. The town whispered about her, not with pity but with suspicion, as though grief itself were a failing. Since the death of her husband, she had lived on the edge of the community, tolerated but never embraced. Women crossed the street when she passed. Men looked too long, then turned away, remembering their wives. And Clara bore it all with the composure of someone who had long since grown used to silence. Inside the cabin, the fire had died again. She had chopped what wood she could, her hands blistered, the axe handle slick with frost. But wood alone did not warm a house when walls leaked wind, and roofs groaned under snow. Clara lit her lantern, its weak glow pushing shadows back only a little. She was tired, weary in her bones, yet it was not fatigue that unsettled her most. It was the fear of vanishing quietly into the night, without anyone to notice. The general store that afternoon had reminded her of her place. She had gone for flour, though she could barely afford it, and as she stood in line, she heard Mrs. Hattie Rose's voice behind her, sharp as a pin. "A woman alone like that shouldn't linger. Not decent, not safe. She's been a widow too long, it makes folk uncomfortable." The words were not meant for Clara's ears, yet they reached her all the same, lodging in her chest like splinters. She had lowered her gaze, counted the coins in her hand twice, and left without answering. Outside the store she had seen Samuel Carter, his tall figure impossible to miss even from a distance. He was tying his horse, the snow dusting his broad shoulders, his hat pulled low. 33, they said, and though wealthy, he kept to himself. He owned one of the largest ranches in the county, and while men respected him and women spoke of him in admiring tones, he seemed uninterested in company. He rarely joined the gatherings at the saloon, nor did he linger in town longer than business required. Some claimed he was proud, others whispered of some old wound that made him keep apart. Clara had looked away before he could see her. She was tired of men looking, better to avoid it altogether. But as evening thickened into storm, she could not escape the truth that her solitude had become unbearable. The wind pressed against her cabin with the weight of 1,000 hands, rattling the windows, whistling through cracks in the boards. The fire sputtered and died, leaving her breath and pale clouds in the room. Fear is often less about danger than about emptiness, and Clara felt the hollow of her life pressing in. She could hear the echo of Hattie Rose's words, not decent, not safe. And she thought suddenly, desperately, I don't want to be alone anymore. She wrapped her shawl tighter, lifted her lantern, and stepped into the storm. Snow clung to her lashes, her boots sinking deep as she stumbled through the drifts toward town. It was madness, she knew, to seek anyone at such an hour. But madness and need often share the same skin. The lantern's flame shook with her trembling hand, casting unsteady light on the whiteness all around. At the edge of town she saw him again, Samuel Carter, adjusting the saddle on his horse before riding home. The snow haloed around him, his movements steady despite the cold. For a moment Clara faltered. What right had she to approach him, to ask anything of him? He was a man of standing, and she was a woman spoken of in whispers. Yet desperation nudged her forward. He noticed her before she found her voice, his dark eyes narrowing slightly beneath the brim of his hat. He said nothing, only waited, the snow settling quiet on his shoulders. Clara swallowed, her throat raw from the wind, and forced the words past trembling lips. I don't live alone anymore, please stay with me. It was barely more than a whisper, yet it carried the weight of all her winters, all her grief. The words startled her as much as they startled him, because they were not rehearsed, not even formed until they left her mouth. She had not meant a confession, nor an invitation. It was simply the truth of her soul spilling out, fragile and unguarded. Samuel studied her. His silence stretched, long enough that Clara feared she had shamed herself beyond repair. But his gaze held no mockery, no judgment. It was steady, the way the earth is steady beneath snow. Slowly he stepped closer, and the space between them filled with warmth she had not expected. Without speaking, he reached for her lantern, steadying it in his hands. Then he removed his coat, heavy and lined with wool, and draped it over her shoulders. The gesture nearly undid her. No words, no explanation, just a simple act of kindness, heavier than any declaration. She clutched the coat around her body, feeling its warmth seep through her chilled bones, and realized she had not felt protected in years. Her lips parted, but she could not find thanks large enough for what the moment meant. Samuel's voice, when it finally came, was low and unhurried. "It's too cold to stand out here." That was all, nothing more. Yet in that single sentence was the promise she had craved, not abandonment, not distance, but presence. Together they walked back through the snow to her cabin. He carried the lantern, his steps steady, hers faltering yet guided by his quiet strength. At the threshold, Samuel paused, studying the sagging roof, the wind-blown door, the cold silence pressing against the walls. Then, with the ease of a man accustomed to work, he moved inside, stoking the fire back to life, splitting kindling with swift, practiced motions. The flames rose, casting their faces in gold. Clara stood in the corner, still wrapped in his coat, watching him. She realized that her plea had not driven him away, nor had it brought ridicule. Instead, it had summoned something she had not expected: mercy. He did not ask for her story, did not speak of the town's gossip, did not weigh her worth against her solitude. He simply stayed, and in staying, he offered her the things she had thought forever lost, the comfort of not being forgotten. When the fire crackled full and the warmth filled the room, Samuel sat back on his heels, looking at her only once, briefly, as though to say, "You are safe for now." Clara lowered her gaze, a tear sliding hot against her cold cheek, not of sorrow but of relief. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt the burden of loneliness ease, just enough to breathe. Outside, the storm howled and the snow deepened, but within the cabin, firelight spread across the walls. The silence between them was not empty but alive, carrying the faintest pulse of something new, something waiting to be named. And though Clara could not yet call it love, it was enough that Samuel had stepped closer when she had whispered. Enough that, on this night of snow and silence, she was no longer alone. Morning broke with a pale hush, the storm spent, leaving behind a world softened by snow. The cabin stood half buried, smoke rising from its chimney like a thin promise. Inside, warmth lingered from the fire Samuel had coaxed back to life, and Clara woke with the sensation of safety she had almost forgotten. For a moment she thought herself dreaming, that the weight of his coat around her shoulders had been a trick of memory, but when she lifted her eyes, there he was, sitting by the hearth, quiet, as though he belonged to the silence itself. He did not look at her at first, his attention fixed on the flames. His posture was composed, shoulders square, a man accustomed to holding himself still. Clara studied him cautiously, wondering at his presence, at why he had not simply left when the storm quieted. The town would not look kindly on his decision. She knew what people would say, what they would believe without evidence, that she had lured him, that he had compromised himself by staying. But Samuel seemed untouched by such concerns, his calm suggesting that he had weighed them already and chosen to remain regardless. Clara rose quietly, tightening her shawl, moving about the small room with deliberate care. She set a kettle near the fire, hands trembling less than they had the night before. She was aware of his eyes on her now, not prying but attentive, as though memorizing the simple rhythm of her movements. When she offered him tea, her hand shook as she passed the cup, yet he accepted it without comment, his fingers brushing hers only briefly, warm against her cold skin. That brief touch startled her more than the storm had. It was not bold, not invasive, but it reminded her how long she had gone without the human kindness of contact. The hours stretched, and Samuel remained. He repaired her roof with measured efficiency, climbing to clear snow, hammering loose boards into place, each strike of the nail echoing with reassurance. He carried in firewood, split logs, stacked them neatly by the hearth. He spoke little, but his silence was not heavy, it was steady, like the rhythm of a heart that knew its purpose. Clara found herself watching him in secret, noting how each act seemed both practical and deliberate, yet carried an undercurrent of something she dared not name. But the world beyond her cabin was not blind. That afternoon, the sound of voices drifted from the road. Mrs. Hattie Rowe, wrapped in fur despite the clear sky, had seen Samuel's horse tied outside Clara's home. By evening the whispers had reached the saloon, the general store, the church steps. They said Clara had trapped him with her need, that Samuel was foolish to risk his name on a widow whose loneliness bordered on scandal. Gossip spreads faster than wildfire when winter leaves hearts restless, and by the following day the whole town had taken sides, most against her. Clara felt it immediately. At the well, two women hushed their conversation when she approached, one of them smirking as if she knew more than Clara herself. At the store, the clerk avoided her eyes, handing over her goods with unnecessary haste. Each glance, each muttered word, pressed on her chest until breathing grew difficult. Shame clawed at her, though she knew she had done nothing wrong. Still, the burden of judgment was heavy, and she wondered whether Samuel should leave, whether his kindness would cost him more than it could ever give her. That night, as she sat by the fire, she tried to tell him. Her voice was low, her words stumbling. "They will talk," she said, eyes fixed on her folded hands. "They already are. I won't have your name tarnished for my sake. You should go before they decide you've lost your place among them." For the first time since he arrived, she heard a change in his tone. Not sharp, not angry, simply unyielding. "Let them talk," he said, his gaze steady. "A name means little if it is not tied to decency. And I'll not leave you here to face the winter alone because some neighbor finds gossip easier than charity." His words silenced her, but silence did not soothe. She feared the town's cruelty would not end at whispers. And she was right. Within days, a small crowd gathered outside her cabin. The snow crunched beneath boots, voices rising like a low storm. Men and women alike muttered accusations, some subtle, some direct. The sheriff himself arrived, not to arrest but to caution. He spoke in measured tones to Samuel, urging him to consider the impression his presence left. Clara stood inside, trembling, listening through the thin wood of the door, shame coursing through her veins like ice. It felt as though her life were on display, her worth weighed by those who had never once offered her kindness. Then the door opened, and Samuel stepped onto the porch. He stood tall, his figure framed by the pale sweep of snow behind him, his voice carrying over the mutters with calm strength. "You want truth?" he asked, his tone even. "Then hear it. This woman has suffered more than any of you cared to see, and still she endures. You call her a burden, a scandal, because it is easier than admitting your own cruelty. But she will not face this winter alone, not while I have breath. You can whisper, you can judge, but you will not shame her while I stand here." The crowd shifted uneasily. Some averted their eyes, others turned away altogether, unwilling to meet the weight of his words. Even Sheriff Granger said nothing more, only tipped his hat and left. One by one, the rest followed, their self-righteous energy dissolving into the cold. The night closed around them, quiet again, the storm of voices dispersed. Inside, Clara sank to the floor, overcome. Tears came, not of weakness but of release, as though the tight knot within her chest had at last broken open. Samuel knelt beside her, his large hands gentle as he took hers, guiding them against his chest. She felt the steady beat beneath his ribs, a rhythm unshaken by all that had just passed. "You're safe," he said softly, and the words carried more weight than any vow. She lifted her eyes to his, searching, afraid, hopeful. What she saw there was not pity, not obligation, but something deeper, an unwavering steadiness that held room for her, even in her brokenness. She had asked him to stay, and he had done more than that. He had chosen to stand with her when the world turned away. The firelight flickered, shadows dancing across the walls, and in that gentle glow Clara felt a shift within herself. She was no longer the woman whispered about in corners, the widow abandoned to solitude. In his presence she felt dignity stirring, self-worth long buried beneath grief rising again. It was not love declared, not passion confessed, but it was the beginning of something truer, the simple, steady grace of belonging. Outside, the snow gleamed beneath the moon, the cabin a warm glow against the cold expanse. Two shadows moved within, no longer separate but together, their silence alive with promise. And though the road ahead was uncertain, one truth stood clear: she would not face it alone.